The gun went off before anyone could breathe. One moment, the warehouse on Via Settembre was filled with the low hum of men moving crates, speaking in the codes and half-sentences that men in their world always used. Careful, measured, never loud. The next moment, the sound cracked through the air like a whip against stone, and a man named Rocco Fabbri dropped to the concrete floor with a hole in his left kneecap and a scream that died halfway up his throat because Vincenzo Moretti's hand closed over his mouth before it could reach the ceiling. "You will not scream in my warehouse," Vincenzo said quietly. That was the thing about Vincenzo Moretti. He never raised his voice, not once, not ever. In a world where men believed that volume was power, Vincenzo had long understood that silence was the real weapon. He had built his empire not on thunderclaps, but on whispers, on the kind of stillness that settled over a room when he walked in, the kind that made even hardened men suddenly remember they were mortal. He crouched beside Rocco, who was trembling and sweating through his expensive shirt, and tilted his head the way a man might tilt his head at a curious painting, studying it, not troubled by it, simply reading it. "You skimmed from my shipment," Vincenzo said. It was not a question. Not once, not twice. 7 times, Rocco. 7 times in 4 months. 7 separate occasions when you looked at what did not belong to you and decided that no one was counting. "Don Moretti, I swear on my mother." "Your mother is a good woman," Vincenzo said, standing slowly and with the ease of someone who was not concerned about the bleeding man at his feet. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cufflinks, the silver ones Isabella had given him on his birthday 3 years ago, and looked at the 2 men standing at the door. Get him out of here. Find out who he was working with, if anyone, and Rocco. He glanced down one final time, meeting the man's eyes. "If I find out you shared so much as a single name with anyone outside this family, I will visit your mother myself, not to threaten her, just to tell her what kind of man her son turned out to be. That, I think, would be worse." He left the warehouse without looking back. Outside, the Milan night was cold and clean, the kind of cold that made the city feel like a painting, all amber streetlights and dark stone, and the distant sound of traffic moving like blood through veins. He walked to his car, a black Mercedes that had been waiting at the curb with the engine off, because old Enzo, his driver for 13 years, knew better than to sit with a running engine outside a warehouse on Via Settembre at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Vincenzo got in, sat in silence for a moment, and stared through the windshield at the street in front of him. "Home, Don Moretti?" Enzo asked. "Yes," Vincenzo said. "Home." Enzo did not speak again. He never did unless spoken to, which was one of the many reasons Vincenzo trusted him more than most of the men who spoke to him daily. Home was a villa on the outskirts of the city, large, gated, surrounded by gardens that bloomed in spring and stood bare and dignified in winter, like old men in formal coats. It was not the kind of home that screamed wealth, the way some of his rivals preferred. No gold fixtures, no visible excess, no attempt to impress. It was simply secure, private, well-built. And inside it lived the only person in the world who had ever made Vincenzo Moretti feel something close to peace. Her name was Isabella. She was 23 years old, small-boned and dark-eyed, with the kind of quiet that filled a room rather than emptying it. She had been mute since birth, a condition the doctors explained with long words that boiled down to this: her voice simply never came. The mechanism was there, the anatomy was intact, but the sound never arrived, and eventually the doctors had stopped expecting it to, and eventually Isabella herself had stopped waiting for it. She had grown up in silence, learned to live in it the way fish learn to live in water, not as a deprivation, but as the simple fact of what the world was made of. And in doing so, she had developed a way of seeing the world that most people never managed because they were too busy filling it with noise. Vincenzo had adopted her when he was 19 and she was 7. Their parents had died together on a rain-slicked road outside of Turin, a Tuesday evening in November, and the extended family had looked at the small, mute girl with the dark eyes and the notepad she carried everywhere and seen only a problem, a burden, an inconvenience, a child who could not make herself understood in the ordinary way, and who would therefore require more than anyone wanted to give. Vincenzo had looked at her and seen his sister. He had not hesitated, not for a single moment. He had signed the papers, moved her into his apartment, small then, just 2 rooms above a dry cleaner's on a narrow street in a part of Milan no one would have called fashionable, and set about building the kind of life that could protect her. The fact that the life he built was the life he built was something he carried with him always, a private guilt wrapped in a private necessity. He had kept her away from it all. He knew he was powerful, knew that men feared him, knew that his business was not the kind you could explain to a tax inspector or a priest, but the specifics, the shipments, the bodies, the back rooms, and the board meetings that happened at 2 in the morning with men who chose their words like surgeons chose their instruments, those she had never seen, or so he believed. He arrived home at 11:30. The villa was quiet, most of the staff long gone for the night, only 2 of his guards at the gate and 1 inside by the main door. Luca, young, built like a wall, who nodded when Vincenzo entered and said nothing because he too had learned that silence in this house was a form of respect. Vincenzo walked through the marble hallway, loosened his tie, and was heading for the stairs when he noticed the light still on in the small sitting room at the end of the hall. He paused. He looked at his watch. It was nearly midnight. He pushed open the door. Isabella was curled in the armchair by the window, a sketchbook open in her lap, her dark eyes lifting immediately when he entered. She always heard him before she saw him, something that had always quietly pleased him and which she had never once acknowledged as unusual. She studied him the way she always did, carefully, completely, with that reading quality her gaze had that no camera could ever capture. Then she reached for the small notepad she kept on the side table beside her, the one she kept in every room in this house, because Isabella did not go anywhere in this house without a way to speak. She wrote something quickly and held it up. "You look tired." "I am tired," he said, and sat on the edge of the sofa across from her. He looked at her sketchbook and saw she had been drawing the garden, the bare winter trees with their complicated branches, the stone fountain gone still for the season, a bird sitting on the wall in that particular posture birds had in winter, as though conserving something. It was a good drawing. She had always been able to draw. "You should be in bed, Piccola," he said, "little one." He had called her that since she was 7 and had not stopped, and she stopped objecting to it somewhere around age 17, which he chose to interpret as acceptance. She wrote again, "I waited for you." He looked at those 3 words. Something in them, the simplicity, the complete normalness of it, this person who waited up for him the way ordinary sisters waited up for ordinary brothers, loosened something in him that had been tight all evening. "Go to sleep, Piccola," he said, and his voice was quieter than usual. "I have meetings tomorrow, early." She nodded, closed her sketchbook, and stood. She crossed the room to him and pressed a kiss to his forehead, something she had done since she was 7 years old, and the world had been too large, and he had been the only constant thing in it. And it was a habit that had never broken, no matter how old either of them had gotten. Then she padded out of the room in her wool socks, leaving him alone with the lamplight and the quiet. He sat there for a while longer than he needed to. He thought about Rocco Fabri's face on the warehouse floor. He thought about the 7 discrepancies. He thought about the word trust and how many times he had used it over 15 years and what exactly he had meant by it each time. Then he went to bed, and he did not dream. The meetings began at 7 the next morning. They were held in the study on the ground floor, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a heavy oak desk that had belonged to Vincenzo's predecessor, a man named Carlucci, who had been intelligent and prosperous and had made the mistake of trusting too many people for too long. He had died at 51 in a hospital bed from something that was not officially a poisoning, but that everyone in their world understood to be. Vincenzo had inherited both the desk and the lesson it contained. His 3 senior lieutenants arrived at 7 sharp. They always did. Vincenzo rewarded punctuality the way he rewarded loyalty, quietly, consistently, and without making much of it, because he had found that men noticed what was rewarded and adjusted themselves accordingly. Antonio Greco came first. He was 44, silver-haired, with the face of a man who had once been genuinely handsome and still carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he remained so. He handled the northern operations, shipping routes, port contacts, the delicate and continuous diplomacy of customs officials who needed to be paid just enough, and politicians who needed to be reminded just often enough of what they owed and to whom. He had been with Vincenzo for 11 years. He knew more about how the organization functioned than anyone except Vincenzo himself. He spoke well in difficult rooms, could read people quickly, and had a gift for knowing precisely when to press and when to back away. He had been, in every visible sense, Vincenzo's most valuable man. Or so Vincenzo had believed. Salvatore Mancini arrived at 4 minutes past 7, which was as close to punctual as Salvatore ever allowed himself. He was 38, stockier than Antonio, with thick forearms and blunt hands that looked wrong for the financial work he was so exceptionally good at. He had a mind that moved faster than his body ever suggested. He ran the financial side of the empire, the laundering, the shell companies, the offshore arrangements, the paper architectures so complex and so carefully designed that more than one prosecutor had picked them up, studied them for months, and quietly put them back down. He was brilliant at it in the way that gifted people are brilliant at things they were born to do. Vincenzo had often thought that if Salvatore had been born into a different family, into a different life, he would have run a bank and appeared on the covers of magazines. Marco De Luca came last, arriving at exactly 7 on the dot, and as always, he managed to make his punctuality look effortless in a way that Antonio's precision never quite did. Antonio was punctual the way a soldier was punctual, from discipline. Marco was punctual the way a clock was punctual, because it was simply how he functioned. Marco was 35, lean, quieter in his own right than the others, not the deep quiet of someone like Vincenzo, but the surface quiet of a man who was always calculating something, always triangulating. He handled security and intelligence, who was talking to whom across families, what the rivals were planning and when and against whom, which of their own men were restless and why. He was, in Vincenzo's estimation, the most dangerous of the three, not because he was violent, but because he was perceptive. A man who sees clearly and in time is more dangerous than any weapon. The three of them together formed the spine of the Moretti organization. Without any one of them, the machine would strain. Without all three, it would likely collapse. Vincenzo had known this and had built around it deliberately for years, and for years it had functioned precisely as designed. They took their seats around the desk. Coffee was brought by a young woman named Chiara, who worked in the house, and who moved efficiently and without looking at anyone. The morning began. They moved through the agenda, the Fabri situation, which Vincenzo addressed in 3 sentences with no particular emotion and which he considered fully closed. A delayed shipment from Marseille that had been held by weather and needed rerouting. A problem with the city councilor who had begun making noise about reconsidering his arrangement and who would need to be reminded carefully of what he had agreed to and why. They talked about the northern routes, about a new contact in Genoa, about a disagreement between 2 of their lower men that had escalated further than it should have and needed resolution before it became something requiring more active management. Vincenzo listened more than he spoke. He asked precise questions and made 2 decisions, and both were accepted without discussion, because in this room, when Vincenzo Moretti made a decision, it was not a proposal. The meeting ended at 9:15. The 3 men stood and filed out with the ease of people who did this every week and found it unremarkable. And Vincenzo remained at his desk with his coffee and his correspondence and the particular quality of silence that followed a room emptied of people. An hour passed, then another. At 11, he stood to stretch, rolled his shoulders, and reached for a new folder, and then he stopped. There was something on the corner of his desk that had not been there when the meeting began. He was absolutely certain of this because the desk was one of the things Vincenzo observed exactly, the position of every pen, every folder, every cup,
every piece of paper. It was not paranoia, it was simply how his mind worked, had always worked, a habit installed so young it had long since become invisible. The thing on his desk was a small folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a notepad. On the outside, in handwriting he knew as well as his own, better, because he had been reading it for 16 years, were 2 letters, V. He unfolded it. "They're going to hurt you. You don't know who they are, but I do." He read it once, then again, then a third time, not because the words were ambiguous, but because he was allowing himself to feel each one before he let himself think. His first response was complicated in a way that he did not try to simplify. There was the warmth of it. This was Isabella, sitting in that chair by the window and worrying about him, writing to him because she could not speak to him, choosing this moment rather than any other. That warmth was genuine, and it mattered. But beneath the warmth, and already cooler and more insistent, was the question, how would she know? He picked up the note again and held it with both hands and looked at it carefully. The handwriting was hers, absolutely, unambiguously. He had her drawings on his desk, her birthday notes in a drawer, 16 years of her careful script, and he knew every curve and angle of it. The message was not vague, it was not anxious speculation. She had not written, "I'm worried," or "Please be careful." She had written, "They're going to hurt you," and she followed it immediately with, "You don't know who they are, but I do." Present tense, active, specific, certain. He folded the note and placed it in his inside jacket pocket, close to his chest, as if it were something that might escape. Then he went to find her. He found her in the garden, despite the cold, sitting on the low stone bench near the fountain, with her wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck, her breath making small, patient clouds in the February air. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel, and her expression did not change, not in the guilty way, not in the startled way, in the way of someone who had been expecting this and had prepared for it.
He sat beside her on the bench without asking permission. He took the note from his pocket and held it between them, face up, without saying anything. She looked at it, then at him. He waited. She reached for her notepad, which she had in her coat pocket as she always did, and she took longer than usual to write. When she finally held it up, he leaned forward and read carefully. "I see things. People forget I'm there because I don't speak. They talk in front of me like I'm part of a furniture, like a lamp or a painting. They forget to perform. I've been listening for years, Vincenzo. I wasn't going to say anything because I didn't want you to worry, and because I wasn't sure, and because—" She paused in the writing. He could see where the pen had lifted. "Because I was afraid of what it would mean for you if it was true. But 3 days ago I heard something I can't keep to myself anymore. Something specific, something real." He read it twice. Then, "What did you hear?" She wrote. He waited with the patience he always brought to things that mattered, without looking away, without checking his phone, without doing anything except being there on the stone bench in the cold garden while she assembled the truth. She held up the pad. "I was in the library reading. The door was open to the hallway. 3 of your men came in through the side entrance. I don't believe they knew I was there because the angle of the doorway meant they couldn't see me from where they stood. They were speaking quietly, but sound carries strangely in this house. They used numbers I recognized from conversations I've overheard over the years, specific amounts, specific accounts, and they talked about afterwards, about who would step in, about how the outside party would move once things had been handled. They didn't use the word killed. They didn't need to. The word they used was cleared. Once you've been cleared, they said. I understood what they meant. I'm not a child." Vincenzo read the note without any expression that would have been visible to a stranger. But Isabella was not a stranger, and she was watching him with the complete attention she gave to everything, and she read what a stranger could not have seen, the fractional tightening around his eyes, the small absolute stillness that settled over him at the word cleared. 3 men, he said. She nodded. Which 3? She held his gaze for a long moment. Her hands were steady on the notepad. She looked down at it, wrote 1 line and held it up without quite meeting his eyes, as though she needed a moment before she could watch him receive the information.
Antonio, Salvatore, Marco. The fountain was still. The bird had gone. Beyond the garden wall, the city hummed with its ordinary, indifferent morning, and the world continued without adjustment, because the world did not know what Vincenzo Moretti had just read in his little sister's handwriting on a bench in the cold garden of his house. He stood up. "Go inside," he said. "Stay in your room today. Don't come downstairs until I come for you." She grabbed his arm. She was fast when she needed to be. She wrote with the other hand, holding the pad up toward him. "Don't do anything without being certain, please. I don't want to be the reason. You are not the reason for anything that has happened or that will happen," he said. And his voice was quiet, but it had the quality of something that had been decided. "You gave me information. What I do with it is mine to own. Do you understand me?" She held his gaze. "Isabella, do you understand me?" She nodded slowly. "Good. Go inside." She looked at him for another long moment, that reading gaze, taking everything in, nothing missed, and then she stood and walked back toward the house with her sketchbook under her arm, and she did not look back, because she had learned long ago that Vincenzo hated being watched walking away. If you're new to this channel, now is a great time to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Leave us a comment telling us what you think of the story. We read every single one. And if you'd like to support us further, there's a link in the description where you can buy us a cup of coffee. It helps us keep creating stories like this one. Now let's get back to Vincenzo. He did not act that afternoon. This was the first thing to understand about Vincenzo Moretti, the thing that separated him from the men who had tried to take what he had and failed. He did not move from feeling. He was not Rocco Fabbri, panicking and stealing in small, desperate amounts and hoping no one was counting. He was not the kind of man who heard something and reacted to it with his body before his mind had finished its work. He had survived 15 years at the top of the most dangerous organization in the north of Italy by doing exactly one thing, over and over, thinking before acting, and then acting without hesitation. So he spent the afternoon doing something that looked, from the outside, like ordinary work. He reviewed the financial reports that Salvatore's office had submitted that week. He cross-referenced them against records he kept separately, a parallel system, known to no one, that he had created in his second year of running the organization after a near miss that had taught him in the most immediate possible way that a man who relies entirely on other people's accounting is a man who deserves to be robbed. He worked methodically, going back 3 months, and by 3 in the afternoon he had found 4 discrepancies. They were small, the kind of thing you would walk past if you were not specifically looking, if you trusted the person who had prepared the numbers. Amounts shifted between accounts at unusual intervals, moved through shell companies that appeared in none of the documentation Vincenzo had approved. Someone had been careful. Someone had been very, very careful, but not careful enough. By 5 o'clock, he had pulled security logs, not the logs that his security team maintained, but the secondary logs he ran through a system his team did not know existed, and found 3 meetings that had taken place outside the normal operational schedule. A restaurant in the Brera district on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks ago, a hotel outside Como 5 weeks after that, and most recently, a private room in a club in the eastern part of the city that Vincenzo knew was operated by a man named Carmine Ferretti. The Ferretti family had been Vincenzo's uneasy neighbors for 3 years. They controlled a smaller territory to the southeast, ran a different kind of operation, messier, more volatile, with a higher turnover of people and a lower level of what Vincenzo would have called institutional discipline. He had maintained a working arrangement with them, parallel tracks, occasional cooperation, mutual non-aggression. He had never trusted Carmine Ferretti the way you trust an ally. He had trusted him the way you trust a loaded weapon kept at arm's length. As long as you understood it, it would not hurt you. Antonio, Salvatore, and Marco, all 3 at the restaurant. Salvatore and Marco at Como, all 3 at the Ferretti Club. Vincenzo sat with this information until the evening light went out of the window and the room darkened around him, and he sat in the dark for a while because he did not feel like turning on the light. He let the information settle. He let it arrange itself in his mind the way a city arranges itself once you understand its streets. everything connecting, everything making a kind of sense that did not require you to like it. Then he called his assistant and asked him to arrange a meeting for the following morning. 9 o'clock. The study. All three men. The usual room? His assistant asked. Yes, Vincenzo said, and closed the gates afterward. There was a pause on the line. His assistant had been with him for 8 years. He had heard many things in 8 years, and he understood precisely what certain instructions meant. Yes, Don Moretti, he said quietly. That night, Vincenzo could not sleep, but he did not fight it. He sat in the leather chair by the unlit fireplace in his study with a glass of good whiskey that he barely touched, and he thought. He thought with the deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered, not rushing, not flinching. He thought about Antonio, 11 years. Antonio had been at his father's memorial service, had stood beside him during the worst year of rebuilding after Carlucci, had once driven 4 hours in the middle of the night to pull Vincenzo out of a negotiation that had turned dangerous. He had a wife, Juliana, whom Vincenzo had met exactly 4 times, and who had always seemed to genuinely love her husband in the unreflective way that good women sometimes loved complicated men. He thought about Salvatore. Salvatore's daughter had been born 3 years ago, Elena, named after Salvatore's grandmother. He had come to the office the morning after the birth with dark circles under his eyes and the private, helpless joy of a man who has become a father for the first time and does not know how to contain it. Vincenzo shook his hand and said congratulations, and meant it. He thought about Marco who had saved his life. It had been 3 years ago, a parking garage on the south side, a meeting that went wrong in the way that meetings occasionally went wrong, and Marco had spotted something, a shadow, a movement, an angle that didn't match 40 seconds before the first shot, and said quietly, "Down, Don Moretti." 40 seconds. That was the difference between Vincenzo Moretti's continued existence and its alternative. He sat with all of this, and he felt the weight of it, and he did not look away from the weight, because looking away was a luxury he could not afford. And then he thought about Isabella's note, about Isabella on the bench in her scarf, writing carefully, holding the pad up without quite meeting his eyes, about the word cleared, about the Ferretti family and what they would do with his organization in the first 3 months after it changed hands, about the accounts he had found, the meetings he had mapped, the architecture of a plan that had been built carefully and over time by 3 men who had eaten at his table. He thought about Isabella alone in a world where the only person who had ever protected her was gone. He drank the whiskey. He sat in the dark a while longer. Then he went to bed. She was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs at 6:15, which he had expected because Isabella had always risen early, had always found the early morning hours more useful than sleep when something was pressing. She had made coffee, proper coffee, the way he had taught her, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she set a cup in front of him without being asked and sat across from him at the kitchen table. They looked at each other. She wrote, "Did you find anything?" "Yes," he said. She absorbed this with the particular stillness of someone who had hoped to be wrong. Then, "What will you do?" "What needs to be done," he said. She looked down at the table. Her hands were flat against the wood, fingers spread, the way they got when she was thinking carefully. Then she wrote something and held it for a long moment before showing him, as though she needed to decide one more time whether to send it. "I don't want you to become like them." He looked at those words. He had read them on the note, 5 words that had somehow arrived at the exact center of what mattered. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I am not like them," he said, "and I never have been. The things I have done to protect what belongs to me. You are what belongs to me. You are the reason all of it exists." He paused. "I need you to stay upstairs today. I need you to trust me." She looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming into the kitchen from the east window, pale and clean, touching the edge of the table and the rim of her coffee cup. She looked young in it. She had always looked young, always looked like the 7-year-old girl he had brought home from the system, even now when she was 23 and sharper than most people he had ever met. She wrote, "I always have." He squeezed her hand. Then he released it, stood, took his coffee, and walked to the study. At 9 o'clock exactly, Antonio Greco, Salvatore Mancini, and Marco De Luca came through the study door. The room was arranged precisely as it always was for morning meetings. 3 chairs positioned before the desk, coffee on the side table, the winter light coming through the tall windows and casting long, pale rectangles across the floor that made the room look, for those few hours, almost peaceful. Chiara had brought the coffee and left. The door had been closed. Everything was the same. Nothing was the same. Vincenzo was standing behind the desk when they entered, which was not his habit. He was very still, both hands flat on the desk surface, and he watched them file in with the composed attention of a man who had already made his decisions and now is only observing the final moments before they are enacted. "Sit down," he said. They sat. There was a brief adjustment of chairs, a setting down of phones. All 3 had phones on the desk, which he noticed, and then they were still, and for 3 seconds the room was quiet in a way that none of them could have articulated, but that all 3 of them felt. Antonio went first, because Antonio always went first. He had the seniority and the silver hair and the confidence of a man who had never, in 11 years, walked into this room with any reason to be afraid of it. "Don Moretti, before we begin, I want to raise the question of the Napoli contacts. There's been movement on their end this week, and I think we should discuss our position before—" "Antonio," Vincenzo said. Antonio stopped. "Tell me about the restaurant in Brera, the Tuesday meeting 6 months ago. All 3 of you." What followed was a silence that had texture and weight. Not the silence of confusion. No one in that room was confused. This was a silence of 3 men making simultaneous calculations, and Vincenzo watched each of their faces in the space of 2 seconds and saw the calculation happening, saw the moment each of them decided on their approach, and knew, with the finality of something measured, that Isabella had been right. Salvatore moved first because Salvatore's mind moved faster than the others. He had always been the quickest to adapt, and this was no different. "It was a social dinner," he said, his voice easy and reasonable, the voice of a man describing something boring. "Old friends, a private occasion, there was nothing relevant to the operation." "You had dinner," Vincenzo said, "at a restaurant owned by a shell company that traces back through 3 layers of paperwork to the Ferretti family. You paid in cash. The dinner lasted 3 hours and 10 minutes, and you repeated the meeting twice more, once outside Como in a hotel I have now fully documented, and once at the Ferretti Club on the Ortles Road." He picked up a single sheet of paper from the desk and held it toward them without releasing it. "This is a summary of what I found. I want you to understand that I found it. I want you to understand what it means that I found it." No one spoke. "The financial irregularities," Vincenzo continued, "go back further. Salvatore, you have been creative with the northern accounts for the better part of 5 months. Small amounts, moved cleverly, through structures that don't appear in any documentation I approved. I know the amounts, I know the accounts. I know where the money is sitting right now." He set the paper down. "So let us not do this the dishonest way, because the dishonest way wastes time, and I find I have no patience for it this morning." Marco tried next. Marco, who understood information and how it worked, who dealt in intelligence, and who knew that in a conversation like this one, the goal was to reframe. "Don Moretti, I think what you're seeing has a context you're not aware of yet." His voice was measured, even careful. "The landscape has been changing. The pressure from Rome, the prosecutor's office, the new scrutiny on the ports. We were exploring options, strategic options, theoretical conversations, nothing more. We were going to bring it to you when we had something concrete." "You were going to bring it to me," Vincenzo said. "Yes, absolutely. The way you brought me the conversation at the Ferretti Club, where Carmine Ferretti's right-hand man, a person named Bianchi, used the specific phrase, 'once you've been cleared.'" He let the words settle in the room the way a stone settles in water, slowly, with ripples. Once you've been cleared, those were the words. Are those the words a strategic conversation uses, Marco? Silence. Marco opened his mouth and then closed it. The calculation behind his eyes was visible in the way the calculations of intelligent men sometimes were when they had run out of moves. Antonio leaned forward in his chair, and something in his posture changed. The performance fell away, the silver-haired charm, the practiced ease of a man who had spent 11 years making difficult things look effortless. What came through instead was something older and harder, and, Vincenzo thought, more honest. You've been in that chair for 15 years, Vincenzo. 15 years, Vincenzo. The world has changed in 15 years in ways that you refuse to acknowledge. The families we deal with, the regulators, the journalists who have your name on lists now, it is not 1998 anymore. The old methods are not sustainable. The old structure is not sustainable. He looked up with something that was almost, but not quite, conviction. We were not removing you from power for personal gain. We were engineering a transition, a necessary evolution. Carmine Ferretti is crude, yes, but he has relationships we don't have, access we don't have. The arrangement we were building would have benefited the entire operation. I see, Vincenzo said. It was not personal, Antonio said. You planned to remove me from this organization, Vincenzo said, and his voice remained at the same level it had held throughout the entire conversation, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had arisen. You planned to remove me from this organization using outside involvement without my knowledge, against my explicit interests. You used the word cleared in the context of my name, in a room with people who do not work for me, and you now ask me to understand that this was not personal? Antonio said nothing. I have a great deal of respect, Vincenzo said slowly, for a man who tells me the truth when I ask for it. I have none, not one fraction, for a man who tells me the truth was something else when I have already seen what it was. He looked at all of them, one after another, unhurried. So, one question. Are there others, inside this organization, names I don't have yet? Antonio looked up at him. For a long moment, the silver-haired man said nothing, and his face went through a series of changes, the last calculation, the final performance, the last remnant of the mask, and then, perhaps because there was no longer any point in it, perhaps because Antonio Greco had always been, underneath everything else, a man who understood the shape of a closed door, he said quietly, "No, it was only us."
Vincenzo looked at him for 3 full seconds. I believe you, he said. He took a step back. He turned and walked to the window, and he stood there looking out at the garden, the bare trees, the still fountain, the stone bench where Isabella had sat yesterday in her scarf, holding up a notepad with steady hands and steady dark eyes, giving him the truth because she could not keep it anymore. I want you to know, Vincenzo said, still facing the window, his voice unhurried, almost reflective, that I have thought about each of you individually, not as a group, as people. He paused. Antonio, I was at your father's burial. I held your arm at the graveside because your knees were not entirely reliable that day, and I held it because I wanted to, not because it was expected. Marco, you saw the shooter in the parking garage before I did, and you moved without a second of hesitation. That is the kind of action that is not forgotten. Salvatore, your daughter drew a picture, and you showed it to everyone who would look at it for 2 weeks. I remember that. He stopped. I remember all of it. The room was completely silent. And I want you to understand that what happens next is not because I have forgotten those things. He turned around. It is in spite of remembering them, because I do not have the luxury of letting what I remember determine what I do. Neither did you when you made your choice. So, here we are. There are things that happen in rooms like that study, on mornings like that February morning, that a story does not need to describe in every particular. The imagination of any person who has followed this story this far will supply what it needs to. What can be said is this. Vincenzo Moretti gave the three men in that room exactly what their actions had made necessary. He did not enjoy it. He did not perform it with cruelty. He was efficient, and he was final, and he did not look away from a single moment of what his own hands were required to do. When it was over, the study was quiet in a different way than it had been before. He stood in the middle of it for a moment, hands perfectly still at his sides, and he breathed, just breathed, slowly, the way you breathe when you have been carrying something very heavy for a long time and have finally set it down. He picked up his phone. The first call was to his assistant. The second was to a man named Ettore, 31 years old, 3 levels below the senior tier, who had been patient and organized and excellent at his work for 2 years without once asking for more than he was given. After the calls, he put the phone down on the corner of the desk, and he left the room. Isabella was on the landing. She was halfway down the stairs, which meant she had not stayed in her room as he had asked, which under ordinary circumstances would have been a conversation. But her face when she saw him was not the face of someone making a defiant gesture. It was the face of someone who had spent 2 hours sitting in silence with enormous fear, and was now letting it go, one careful breath at a time, as she looked at him and determined that he was still here and still himself. She came down the remaining stairs and stood in front of him. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, completely, reading every part of him, missing nothing. She reached for her notepad. He waited. She wrote slowly and carefully, and when she held it up, her hands were steady. "Are you all right?" He considered the question honestly, the way she required. He did not deflect. He did not perform. "No," he said. "Not right now, but I will be." She nodded. She wrote again. "I'm sorry I brought this to you. I know what it cost. You gave me the truth when it would have been easier not to. That is the most important thing a person can do." Another note. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, that you would think I was confused or that I hadn't understood what I was hearing." He looked at her. He thought about how many times, over how many years, he had made decisions about what she could handle, what she needed to be protected from, what she could and could not be trusted with. All of it done with love. All of it done with the best of intentions, and all of it, he understood now, slightly wrong. He have never once underestimated you, and, because it was true, you are the sharpest person I have ever known. I should have told you that sooner. Her eyes were bright. She blinked. She wrote quickly. "They forgot I could see." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "they did. They made the oldest mistake there is. They confused your silence with absence." She put the notepad down at her side. She looked at him. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around him the way she had when she was 7 years old, and the world was enormous and frightening, and he was the only fixed point in it. He stood there for a moment, and then he put his arms around him too, and they stood in the hallway of the villa in the morning quiet for longer than either of them would have counted. Before we get to the final part of this story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Your support genuinely keeps this channel alive, and if you want to do something extra to help us keep making stories like this one, you can buy us a cup of coffee using the link in the description. Every contribution matters more than you know. Now, let's finish this. In the weeks that followed, the Moretti organization went through the quietest restructuring in its history. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. Shipments moved, accounts balanced, the appropriate people received their appropriate arrangements at their appropriate times. 3 senior men had simply ceased to be visible, and in the world of organizations like this one, exits did not always require explanations. From the inside, everything had changed. Ettore was promoted to the senior tier. He was 31, methodical, and possessed of a quality that Vincenzo had come to value above almost all others. He wanted what he had earned and nothing more. He was grateful for competence recognized and worked to justify it. Within 3 weeks, Vincenzo had confirmed what he had observed over 2 years.
Ettore was not brilliant in the flashy way of a Salvatore, not charming in the easy way of an Antonio. He was steady. He was thorough. He was honest in the particular way that meant he told you difficult things when you needed to hear them, rather than easy things that made you comfortable. Vincenzo gave him the northern operations and watched him carefully, and Ettore did not disappoint. 2 other promotions followed, both internal, both men who had been quietly excellent for years without pushing themselves forward. Vincenzo began to understand something he should perhaps have understood sooner. He had been selecting for confidence and selecting against certain kinds of quiet, and in doing so, he had missed the thing that mattered most, which was not how a man presented himself, but what he did when no one was watching him. He had been selecting for the performance of competence rather than competence itself. Antonio had performed brilliantly. Salvatore had performed brilliantly. Marco had performed brilliantly. And behind those performances, in the spaces Vincenzo had not looked, something else entirely had been building. He thought about this often in the weeks that followed. He thought about how much of what he had believed about his organization had been based on watching people who knew they were being watched. He thought about Isabella, who had never performed, who had never needed to, who had simply been exactly what she was in every room she entered, and she had always known it, that she had not been limited by her silence. She had been liberated by it. No one had ever expected anything from her. No one had ever watched her for the performance, and so she had simply watched and listened and understood and become the most reliable source of truth in a house full of professional liars. He had a long conversation about this with Isabella on a Thursday afternoon in the library, the 2 of them at opposite ends of the sofa with her notepad on the cushion between them, passing observations back and forth in the slow, unhurried way of people who have nowhere else to be and nothing they need to perform. She wrote, "Confident men talk. Careful men watch. You want the men who watch." He read it. He thought about Antonio's silver-haired ease, Salvatore's quick mind, Marco's controlled exterior, 3 men who had each believed they understood the board better than the player who had built it. "You're right," he said. She gave him a look. Then she wrote, "I usually am." He shook his head. He looked at her, small and composed on her end of the sofa, her sketchbook beside her, her notepad in her lap, as comfortable in this room as she had always been in this room, because Isabella Moretti was at home everywhere she chose to be, and she had always known it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "How long have you been watching my men? Not just this, not just Antonio and the others. Generally, how long have you been in rooms where things were said and remembering them?" She thought about this for a genuinely long time. Then she wrote, "Since I was about 15. I didn't do it deliberately at first. I just noticed things. And then I realized that noticing was something I could do better than most people, because people stopped monitoring what they said around me very quickly, faster than they stopped monitoring themselves around you. Because they thought your silence meant you weren't listening," he said. "Because they thought my silence meant I wasn't there." He sat with that. She added, "I should have told you sooner about a lot of things, but I didn't know how to start the conversation without making you move through this house, and I didn't want you to worry about what I'd seen."
"You were protecting me," he said. She shrugged, which on Isabella was a complicated gesture, not dismissive, more like an acknowledgement. She wrote, "I protect you the way I can. You protect me the way you can. It's not so different." He looked at her for a moment, then, "I want you involved going forward, in the decisions, particularly the decisions about people. I want to be able to bring you what I'm seeing and ask you what you see." She raised one eyebrow. "Not the operational side," he said immediately. No, never that, but the intelligence side, the assessment of people. That is something you have been doing quietly for 8 years and doing well, and I have been ignoring the resource out of," he paused, "out of the assumption that you needed to be protected from it." She considered this carefully. Then she wrote, "On one condition." "What condition?" She held up the pad. "You stop treating my quietness like a limitation. It isn't. It never has been." He read those words, and he felt them in a specific place. He thought about all the years of managing around her silence, all the years of arranging things so that it would not disadvantage her, as though the silence were the problem rather than other people's failure to work with it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the assumption." She wrote, "You didn't know better. Now you do. That's enough." He nodded slowly, then, "Tell me what you know. Everything you think I need to hear. Start wherever you want." She looked at him for a moment. Then a small expression moved across her face, the near smile, the thing that on any other face would have been a laugh. She wrote, "This is going to take more than one afternoon. I know. I have time." The first real day of early spring arrived on a Saturday, the way those days always arrived in Milan, not as a declaration but as a suggestion, a softening in the air, a quality of light that was different from winter without being quite warm. The fountain in the garden was turned back on that morning. Vincenzo heard it from his bedroom and lay still for a moment listening to it, which was something he had never done before. He came downstairs at 7. He made his own coffee, which he rarely did, and he took it out into the garden and sat on the stone bench and did something he almost never did. Nothing. He simply sat there and let the morning be what it was. The fountain moving, the first faint green beginning in the bare branches, the city doing its distant ordinary thing beyond the walls. After a while, he heard footsteps on the gravel. Isabella was coming toward him in her heavy coat, her sketchbook under one arm, her notepad in her coat pocket. She saw him sitting there with his coffee, apparently doing nothing, and her expression showed a particular kind of quiet surprise. Not alarm, but the genuine startlement of someone who has seen something unexpected. She sat beside him on the bench. They both looked at the garden. After a while, she reached for her notepad. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," he said. She looked at him. "Just sitting," he said. "Is that allowed?" She wrote, "You never just sit." He said, "I'm trying something new." She tilted her head, studied him with that reading quality that nothing had ever been able to switch off, and then she wrote something and showed it to him with the half-smile at the corner of her mouth. "I think I like it." They sat together while the morning moved around them. A bird came and settled on the rim of the fountain and regarded them briefly with the incurious seriousness that birds brought to everything, and then departed on some private errand. The city beyond the walls assembled itself for another day. Isabella opened her sketchbook and began to draw. Vincenzo watched her for a moment, the focused economy of her movements, the complete absorption of a person doing something they were made for, and then he looked away at the trees and the fountain and the particular quality of light that this morning had brought, and he thought about what she had said in the library. "I protect you the way I can. You protect me the way you can. It's not so different." He had spent 15 years looking outward, at ports, at accounts, at faces across tables in rooms where everyone was performing something. He had built an entire machinery of observation and aimed it in every direction except this one, this garden, this bench, this person who had been sitting beside him in one form or another since she was 7 years old. He had not known where to look. She held up her sketchbook. She had drawn the garden. The fountain, the bare trees beginning their slow return, the stone wall, the bench. 2 figures sitting side by side. He looked at it for a long time. "Keep it," he said. She looked at him. Then she wrote, "I always do." He thought about the first note, the folded piece of paper on the corner of his desk with 2 letters on the outside, V. The 12 words inside that had changed everything. He thought about what it had taken for her to write them, to walk into the study, to place them where he would find them, to return to her room and wait in the quiet with everything she knew and no way of knowing what would come next. He thought about what the word love actually meant, when you removed from it every sentimental surface and looked at what was underneath. He thought it meant this: the willingness to give someone the truth, even when the truth is something that will cost them something, even when it is easier and safer to keep it. She had given him the truth. He reached over and rested his hand briefly on her shoulder, the way he used to when she was small and the world had been frightening and that particular weight had meant you were not alone. She put her hand over his for a moment. Then she went back to drawing. They sat in the garden while the morning continued. He thought, as he sometimes did, about the version of himself that existed before Isabella, the 19-year-old with 2 rooms above a dry cleaner's and a plan that didn't extend much past the next 6 months. He had become a different kind of man than he had imagined he would be. He had become harder in some ways and softer in others, and for a long time he had told himself the hardness was what protected her. But it was not the hardness. He understood that now. The hardness was what he pointed at the world. What protected her was something else entirely. This, the sitting, the being present, the willingness to receive her notes in the garden and read them and take them seriously and act on them without diminishing what they had cost her to write. She had saved his life with a piece of paper torn from a notepad, not with a weapon, not with violence, with the thing she had always been best at, paying attention. He looked at her sketchbook, her hand moving, the pencil making the soft scratch and slide of real drawing, nothing rushed, nothing performed. She was drawing the fountain and the wall and the branches above them, and she was doing it the way she did everything, with complete presence, missing nothing. He thought about the note again. V. 12 words. They're going to hurt you. You don't know who they are, but I do. He thought about what it had cost her to write them, to walk into the study, to place them precisely where he would find them, to return to her room and wait in the quiet with everything she knew and no way of knowing what would come next. He thought about the 3 days she had carried it before she could bring herself to put it on paper. 3 days of sitting with that weight, alone. She had carried it because she loved him, and she had given it up because she loved him more than she feared the consequences. That was what love actually was, underneath all the comfortable versions of it. Not the easy thing, the costly thing, the thing you did when there was no version of not doing it that you could live with. The fountain ran. The city went on being the city, and Vincenzo Moretti, feared by men on 5 sides of the compass, undefeated in 15 years of a world that had tried several times and by various means to end him, sat on a stone bench in the early spring light beside his little sister and did not think about any of it. He simply sat there. And that, finally, was enough. If you stayed until the very last word of this story, thank you. Not the quick kind of thank you, but the real kind, from everyone on this team who spent time with you. Stories like this one exist because of the people who watch until the end. Please hit the subscribe button and leave a like on this video. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world to us. Drop a comment below and tell us, what moment hit you the hardest? Was it the note on the desk? The confrontation in the study? Isabella on the stairs? We read every single comment and we respond to as many as we can. And if you want to go one step further and support this channel directly, please consider buying us a cup of coffee using the link in the description. Every cup keeps this channel alive and makes the next story possible. Until next time, remember, the quietest person in the room is often the one who sees everything. Pay attention to them.